Hello and welcome to another episode of Today in Space. This is our Thanksgiving episode. I am your space science podcast host from the East Coast, Alex Giorfanos. We're recording this on planet Earth. The date is November 22nd. Thanks for joining us. This episode, we have a lot to talk about. Obviously, it's Thanksgiving, so we're going to talk about what we're thankful for. That'll come up later in this episode. But we obviously have to start this episode talking about the success of Artemis 1 and the Orion capsule that's now orbiting the moon. And these are crazy, insane times. And when we first started this podcast, I had no idea that things would get so cool in basically a decade. And it's amazing how far things have come. And I'm super, super thankful for, let's start this episode this way. Super thankful for all the engineers and scientists and managers and HR reps and all the people at NASA that worked through 12 years worth of developing a brand new rocket, the world's most powerful rocket, 8.8 million pounds of thrust to the moon, damaged the launch pad. That's how strong that thing was. And that was one of the things we learned when we got to go to a NASA social and visit the mobile launch pad. Literally, the sound is the thing that would kill you. Not the fire, not like the fumes. The sound of that rocket would kill you. And that sound was so powerful that it broke door frames on near the pad, damaged the pad, things that will be fixed by the time Artemis 2 comes around. And today NASA was talking about how they are going to have that fixed. They've addressed it. But just to show you how powerful this is, I was just watching a clip from Scott Manley, and he was describing just how powerful one of those solid rocket boosters are. And it's by themselves. One of those boosters is more powerful thrust-wise than any rocket that exists today, and it has two of them. And that was the crazy thing about that Artemis 1 launch of Space Launch System, which is a rocket that has been for many years criticized, and the effort to make this most powerful rocket the world has ever seen took a lot out of an agency, and it was lucky enough to survive through multiple presidential transitions from President Obama through President Trump back to President Biden, who was the vice president at that time. It's a political rocket, but it's made it, and we're thankful that it exists. That rocket did some crazy stuff. It sent the Orion spacecraft into a tremendously accurate orbit to the moon, and in the last few days, it made it to the moon, and we were able to see a new Earth rise and Earth set as the rocket was going to the back side of the moon, which it's a new moon for us right now. So it was the far side of the moon, but not the dark side of the moon. The Earth was in the dark side of the moon. And I had a cool moment where while that planned loss of signal, that LOS happened when it was on the other side of the moon, same thing we have with the rovers on Mars, whenever Mars goes behind the sun compared to us, that lack of signal, I spent the time listening to part of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, because Earth was on the dark side of the moon. I listened to Money, I listened to Time, I listened to Breathe, and Any Color You Like. It was an incredible experience, and what's so cool is that image, that Earth that you see right there is all of us. That's Carl Sagan has the famous the best way that I think anyone's ever put it, but that blue marble, that tiny blue disco ball, as we called it here on the podcast years ago, and made a little song for it, that is all of us, all of humanity. That was happening, and if you look up now and you see the moon, we are going there. We're visiting that moon of ours that so many of us have only dreamed about. Some of us were alive the last time that we went to the moon, and it was 50 years from when Artemis 1 launched from the last moon mission. And we're living in this very, very incredibly amazing, prosperous time for the progress of space travel. And now it's no longer theoretical. NASA is going to the moon, and the mission is there. It's going to be spending some time using this orbit. I'm going to pull up the name of it because I don't want to get it wrong. And so what the Orion spacecraft is now doing after it took the burn on the far side of the moon is it used the moon's gravity to change its orbit into a distant retrograde orbit. They basically did a flyby of the moon and then used the moon's gravity to put itself in this distant retrograde orbit where we go kind of outside this, we'll call it circular orbit of the moon around the sun, to spend some time where we went real close. We took some pictures and some images. On this next return, when that arc comes back and catches up with the moon, we're actually going to fly over the Apollo landing site. So we're actually going to get images from Orion, which has already shown us tremendous images of these cameras that are set up on the edge of each of these 4 solar arrays that they're able to articulate like arms. It's actually very, very cool. I love how many different modes it has. And, a big thing for spacecraft is obviously if you want to move, you have to use fuel. But you can get really efficient with things like this distant retrograde orbit, very little bit of fuel needed to allow it to orbit, and then using a lot of gravity, right? Free fuel. And one of the mission criteria for this mission is that when this mission launches, it has to be in the sunlight for a certain amount of time for these solar arrays to have power on board. And since those solar arrays can move at their own speed, it actually is really interesting because now you can adapt to wherever you are to make sure that your solar arrays are always pointing and your spacecraft can point a different way. That independence is something that would be very valuable in a mission, especially one like this. So this is all to say it's an extremely exciting time. And the next time that you look up and you see the moon, this is the first time in my lifetime, and I think for a lot of the folks that listen to this podcast, it's the same, where this is the first time in our lifetimes that we can look at the moon. It's no longer dreaming like, oh man, I wish I could go to the moon. I wonder what it was like to be on the moon. This is the first step. This is the first human-rated spacecraft we've had in our lifetimes that's around the moon that is even there. So it's real. So for me, I've always looked up and dreamed and wondered what it was like. So now, every time I look up, it's a whole new era, and that's super exciting. And it's a huge, huge thanks to all the people that spent some of the best years of their lives working at, just the entire NASA Artemis team, from all the engineers that worked there and no longer work there or continue to work on there. Even some of the more senior members, their experience was space shuttle. It was not the Apollo missions and the lunar technology. So some of them may have launched on the Saturn V, but that would have been Skylab, and that would have been the International Space Station with shuttle. So it's a whole new era, and that I'm just super excited. I mean, there's a lot running through my head about like how many different careers must have happened before this point between the moon eras here for NASA, and we're here. It's here. We're going. We're there. See ya.